Today, we're going to be focusing on RFP considerations. We have two main desired outcomes today. The first is to understand the core on-site solar RFP components that are typically found specifically in on-site solar projects. And then the second desired outcome is for you all to have an understanding of some key sticking points that might come up, and then the departments you'd like to, or that you should engage to focus on those sticking points. All right, so just diving into our first main session today on the core components of an on-site solar RFP, we thought it would be helpful before diving into more of the nuances and sticking points that Roby will cover in the second half to just explain at a high level what are the typical sections that you find in an on-site solar RFP. So first, I wanted to give kind of the similar path and timeline that a lot of RFPs specific to on-site solar follow. The RFP development is the largest stage of this process, and that's why we've really been focusing on it and why this webinar is really focused on the actual development of the RFP. And depending on how many sites there are, it might take anywhere from 3 to 6 months, and also depending on just kind of logistics with procurement and city government, could take anywhere from 3 to 6 months typically. And then after that, typically allow for a month or 4 to 6 weeks to solicit responses to the RFP on a public portal such as bidnetdirect.com, where developers can identify that your RFP has been issued, and we'll walk through that actual solicitation timeline in a second, but that's typically around a month. Then there's around a month for negotiation and actually awarding the contract. Again, that kind of depends on how large the contract is, how long that might take. And then the last part is actually constructing the system, interconnecting it to the grid. And that's, again, reliant on how many systems there are. If it's just one, smaller rooftop system, that might just take a month. But if you have an aggregated project across a bunch of sites, maybe that'll take up to 6 months. And that's the general timeline that we're looking at. And what today in the webinar we're focusing on is the RFP development stage. So I wanted to first outline a couple things that take the majority of those 3 to 6 months before diving into the actual RFP components. So the first thing is performing the preliminary site assessment. So that's why over the course of the last 2 or 3 months, we've been working one-on-one with a lot of you to help on that site assessment, because that can really take a lot of the majority of the time is identifying which sites to do and estimating the PV size and gathering that information. Another thing that I'm sure you all are familiar with is how you will have to engage decision makers. So talking to facilities through this development on the sites, talking to legal and procurement when you're writing the RFP, and then also just making sure that from the top down, from mayor or city council, that there is buy-in for this RFP issuing. And then there's obviously the writing of the RFP that takes a while, and then the gathering of the RFP attachments for all of the project sites. So the site drawings, the electrical data, things like that. And the last two parts of this is what we're going to focus on a lot today is what are the main sections of the RFP that you'll be writing, and then one of those is the actual RFP attachment, so what goes into that as well. So this is kind of at a high level, from a timeline perspective, what takes the most amount of time. And now the majority of this section, I'm going to jump into what are the main parts of actually writing the RFP that you'll be looking at. So most on-site solar RFPs typically contain 6 sections. Sometimes, 2 sections are combined into 1 or something, but typically this content is pretty similar across all of them. So there's always the RFP schedule, so the deadlines that are inherent in an RFP, the project overview, so a concise summary of the project so that a developer can skim it and decide whether they want to read more into this RFP. The scope of work that you're looking for the bidder or developer to do. So what's the actual work associated with the RFP that they're on the hook for? The proposal requirements. So what format do the bidders have to submit their proposal in, And in that format, what are the actual aspects that they need to include? The evaluation criteria. So what are the city's main priorities and how will they be evaluating the RFPs to give some transparency into to the developers on how they'll be evaluated. And then lastly, those RFP attachments or exhibits. So all of the kind of additional site drawings and electrical data and roof data, things like that. So these are the 6 main sections, and I'm going to jump into each of these 6 over the next 15 minutes to give you a sense of what is typically found in these sections. So first, with the RFP schedule, the schedule helps to provide accountability for both parties. So from the developer, knowing when they have to submit everything, but also from the municipality side, when are they on the hook to do things like the site visit, actually award or not award a contract, when that will be decided by. So typically in this section, there are 2 main parts. So here I have it A and B. The first is a summary table with all of those timelines. So first I'll walk through what's typically in this table. First is the mandatory site walk. So this is specific to an on-site solar project where typically 2 weeks after the RFP release date, you schedule a site walk with all of the interested developers to actually look at the roofs or the parking lots or ground mounts, whatever you're looking at, to actually perform a site walk. And then you'll specify when the developer has to submit their RFP questions after reading through it and attending the site walk. And then when the municipality is on the hook to answer those RFP questions. So this is kind of some general timelines that we've seen, being 5 business days after the questions are submitted, the municipality answers those questions and things like that. The next part is on the developer side, when they have to let the municipality know that they're intending to submit a proposal, and then when that proposal is actually due. And then after the RFPs have been submitted, the last part is when the municipality will be evaluating and awarding a contract, or letting developers know that a contract will not be awarded. And then the negotiation, and then when the system will be commissioned and operated. And typically, even though I went kind of top down here, it could be helpful to work from the bottom up. So if you have a date in mind when you'd like the on-site solar project to be up and operating, working back in that timeline can help you understand when the RFP should be issued by to achieve that date that you're looking at. And then the second part of this section is typically just specifications on the above table. So for example, how the developer can ask those questions and where those are asked, if that's through email or through a portal, and then how the municipality will answer those questions, how the site walk will be determined, things like that. So just specifications on the above. And then moving on to the second section, the project overview is pretty straightforward. It just concisely provides all the essential information for the developer so that they can determine pretty quickly whether they're interested in reading more into the RFP and getting into the nuances of it. So there's around typically 5 sections in a project overview: an introduction to the project at a very high level, and then specifics on what the municipality's goals are and objectives. So if that's helping to achieve a 100% renewable goal, then specifying whether REC ownership is required. If it's more about resilience or something like that, making sure that that's specified in that section. Some background on the municipality, any helpful information such as have any on-site solar projects been installed in the past, and what sizes are those, where are those located, any particularly relevant information on the actual municipality, legal aspects, or any just helpful information there. An important section is the ownership and financing. So stating upfront, are you looking to buy the system in a direct purchase for direct ownership? Or are you looking to do something like a solar lease or PPA? Or are you open to both and making sure that that's specified upfront? And then the last part is the preliminary site assessment summary table. So in a simple table format, what are the location of the sites? And then the second aspect being, what's the estimated PV system size and PV type, whether that's rooftop, ground mount parking, and then kind of just high level electrical data like the annual electrical usage, so that the developer has an understanding of how big the system might be in relation to its site. And one point of insight here is that the highest time requirement in this section is likely that preliminary site assessment. So that's why we've been focusing on helping you all out in doing those site assessments, prioritizing which sites you want to do, and looking at the nuances of those estimated PV sizes and things like that. The third section, being the scope of work, helps to identify the developer's responsibilities and requirements. So this varies project to project, but things that we've seen include design guidelines. So specifically, if it's a rooftop system, are there any design guidelines that the developer will have to adhere to? Code specifications, so building codes that are relevant, if there are any specifics around modules or inverter specifications that are required, warranties on the modules, the racking, the inverters, any type of warranties that are inherent in the project. And then a big section being the contractor responsibilities. So what is the contractor responsible for in this project? Any nuances regarding safety, monitoring, things like that. And similarly, and sometimes in the same section, if they're responsible for the commissioning of the system, monitoring of it, the ongoing operation and maintenance, things like that. And lastly, the system end of life. So whether at the end of the PV system's life, the contractor's on to remove the system completely, or if there will be a negotiation part at the end of the contract, specifications around what happens when the PV system's contract is up. And a lot of this is likely, in relation to other sections, a low time requirement, because a lot of this can be just copy and pasted from an RFP template and is pretty boilerplate around warranties, code specifications, things like that. So we'll be sending out an RFP template after this, and that'll be helpful for you all to see which sections you can just keep as boilerplate language or that you might need to change. The fourth section, being the proposal requirements, are helpful when they're clear and concise to ensure that the responses are easy to compare and interpret. So typically this section just specifies the format that the developer proposal needs to be in to make sure that all proposals come in the same format so they're easy to compare. Typical formats in proposals are including an executive summary up top with all important information, the price proposal up front as well, since that's typically what a lot of cities are most interested in, and then any technical specifications, production guarantees, design plans, all the nuances around the actual system and how it will operate and produce. Another important thing that you'd want the proposal to include are the developer's experience and financial strength, as long as the project team that's going to be working on your specific project and what that team looks like in terms of their experience. Also, just making sure that the developer submits a proposed set schedule so that you can double check to make sure that that's aligned with your schedule as well. Another thing that we see is an attachment of an Excel spreadsheet that the developer has instructions on what to fill out, so that when they submit their proposal, you don't have to find all the important information and copy that to your own Excel spreadsheet. That's something that the developer just fills out and provides you, so it's less work on your end. And This is also sometimes a load time requirement similar to the last section, because a lot of this is more stating the format that the developer has to submit their bid in, and less work on your end to actually, determine what the specifications are. So a lot of this can be just boilerplate language that you keep from an RFP template, but also something that you might want to check in with procurement on to make sure that the format that the proposal is submitted in the template is aligned with the city or county formats as well that they like to receive their proposals in. And then moving on to the evaluation criteria section, this helps to ensure that the selected project, one, closely aligns to your goals as a municipality, but also helps to provide the developer with visibility into how their RFPs will be evaluated. So it's typically just one short section that includes the criteria and the weighting. So I've included just an example here where some example criteria would be cost effectiveness, if that's most important to you, the developer's qualifications and experience, any type of technical approach, and then maybe you're more interested in local businesses and supporting local jobs. So those are just an example of what could be the evaluation criteria, and then point values associated with that. But obviously that's up to interpretation. And what we would recommend is developing not only the criteria, but the weighting of the point values in concert with whoever in your municipality is going to be on that evaluation team, making sure that that's developed in concert with them so that you don't determine the criteria and point value ahead of time and then pull them in at the end when maybe they would disagree with the actual criteria and values. So making sure that that's all done in concert with those that will be deciding this project, and that that's aligned with the city priorities. All right, so then the last section that I'll cover before jumping into some Q&A is the RFP attachments or exhibits. And these will likely take some time to gather, but are very essential so that the developer can provide an accurate bid. So there's around 6 parts to this typically. One is definitely specifications on the roof if you're doing rooftop systems. So including an aerial photo of the site so the developer knows that they're looking at the right site. Specifications around the roof age and the type of roof they're looking at, any warranties that are associated with it, things of that nature. The second thing that's typically found in RFP attachments is the annual electrical data at each of these project sites. So at a minimum, you'd want to include the monthly bill PDFs for that site, but what developers would be more interested in is the actual hourly load data at those meters. So that's something that you would request from the utility is to have that hourly load data for at least 1 year at those sites, so that the developer can perform an accurate economic assessment, and it might differentiate what sizing they include as well. The next two are as-built drawings for those sites for the structural and electrical drawings. So the structural drawings typically help the developer understand what the load-bearing capabilities of the roof are, so that they can ensure that the roof can hold the PV system, or if they need to include any additional costs for that. And for electrical drawings, that's making sure that the subpanel can actually host the additional system, and then that if there are any specifications around conduit outlays, things like that. So having both of those are important. And the municipality will have their own contract terms and conditions that they're looking at. So including that is important as well, because the developer on their end is going to have their own contract terms and conditions, but being able to specify those up front is going to help not only in the RFP development stage for the developer, but also in the negotiations later on. And then the last thing, as I noted earlier, is that proposal spreadsheet. So if you do have an Excel spreadsheet that you want to attach to where you specify developer fill out net present value, upfront costs, system size, things like that, all in one location. So you don't have to pull that out of a PDF. You'd want to attach that Excel spreadsheet as well. So this, as I said before, this is likely a higher time requirement because acquiring data in general always takes longer than you think. And then working with facilities to gather the roof, structural, electrical drawings can also take a while as well. So that's just a kind of a high level summary of what is actually included in the RFP without getting too nuanced into any of the specifications there that Roby's going to jump into in the next section.
Thanks, Ryan. One of the points of the RFP and what I'll talk about is the more clarity you have in your RFP documents, the less ambiguity there is for the developers, and the more likelihood you can evaluate all the proposals that come in on an apples-to-apples basis and make good decisions. We had talked early on, as you're doing your site assessment pieces, maybe it's good to go visit a roof instead of just using Google Sunroof. Go talk to the building inspector, the electrical, get a better sense of what's going on. But truly, you didn't need to do that in order to do your initial site assessment. I would highly recommend you consider doing that now that we're going to move on to the RFP. Okay, it's a great time as you're getting ready to issue your RFP, walk down the hall, meet the facilities manager or the building engineer or the electrical engineer and say, hey, I'd like to go visit some of these buildings with you and get up on the roofs, etc. Ryan mentioned walkthroughs, and especially for on-site solar, highly recommend them because every site is different. Every building's different. Even if you're doing covered parking or even vacant lots, it can be different. If you just have one large, huge vacant lot, okay, maybe site visits not so necessary, but most of the things we're talking about are real buildings. And so it really helps for everybody to see what's there and talk about it. Again, specifying what you're after, and one of the reasons there could be a maximum of your whole bid. Let's say there's 1,000 kilowatt limit for what you can interconnect with the utility, and you've sized it 4 different roofs at X size per roof, and someone says, oh, we can't use the whole roof that you specified at 300 kilowatts. We got to reduce that system to only 250 because there's new HVAC equipment on there. Well, if they know the target's 1,000, they could try to squeeze in a few more on one of the other roofs and get to that 1,000 kilowatt goal. So it helps the developers to know what they're trying to size to and based on your priorities. Okay. And if there's any other things you want them to consider, optional sites. I think someone was telling us a little bit earlier, they want to leave a contract open for 5 years in case they want to add more systems later. Great to have that in there. Specify it so the bidders know, and you'll see that reflected. But, if there's some sites that are mandatory, you want PV on 5 buildings, say that explicitly as well. The more clarity, the better the responses. Ryan mentioned the rooftop specifications, and we've already had some rooftop discussion, which is appropriate. It's good to meet with your facilities manager to understand, one, are there any concerns on any particular roof? And then what are those concerns? Are they based on the roof membrane? Are they based on the structural ability of that building to hold more load on the roof? Most of the time we're talking about ballasted systems on top of roofs, because if they're not ballasted, that means you're going to be making a lot of penetrations in the roof, and nothing will void your warranty more quickly than that. So you want to make sure it's clear, but if you're adding a ballasted system, how much can the roof support? Depending on the tilt angle, that determines how much wind loading you might have, depending on whether you're in Hurricane Alley, like Miami-Dade, or far, far away from those kinds of concerns up in Anchorage or other places. That will determine how much ballast you need. It's an engineering calculation based on building code and wind loading. So those are things you want to learn about ahead of time. People have talked about having a limit on age, roof age. You know, if the roof is older than 5 years, maybe not included, or certainly older than 10 years, you know, not included. It could be an opportunity to say, well, we do need the roof replacement. How about if we do roof replacement with PV? I know we've talked a lot about the challenges of financing some of these things in different states, different cities because of the rules. I've seen people say, well, if we're replacing the roof, that's a capital improvement budget. We're making the building better by keeping the rain out and, you know, keeping the insulation, keeping the temperature better. Great use of capital funds. And this will apply, you know, to the roofing people, the building engineer, the electrical engineer. When you talk to these people and visit the roof to understand what you go in your RFP, when you have your walkthrough, ask those people to be there, okay? If they can answer questions for the contractors right then and there, that means those are questions you're not going to get in writing the following week that you're then going to be on the hook to answer. So it's a good thing to do it. Electrical, if at all possible, it's nice to specify ahead of time what is needed. And one of the reasons why is, let's say you get 2 bids back and one says, we're just going to connect to the sub panel, you know, on this floor, in this building, in the electrical room, and we're good to go. And someone else says, that sub panel is not sufficient. We need to add a new sub panel for the PV system. The second bid costs a lot more than the first one, but who's telling the truth? Do you need it or do you not? So you'd like to know that ahead of time, if at all possible. If your facilities electrical engineer can't answer that, if they don't have experience with PV systems, hire a contractor to do that and ascertain. You know, the contractor, if they do the electrical, they also should do the sizing, confirm your sizing estimates for the roof, and then here's how big the PV system will be, here's how big the inverters will be, here's what the load will be going into that sub panel, can it handle it or not? And then knowing that makes it easier for you to evaluate the bids, that you can say specifically, it can fit into this sub panel. You know, we already have that information. So again, it makes it easier for you on the back end when you're getting things. It might be helpful to actually locate with your electrical engineer, where will the inverter or inverters go? If you have a large system, you'll have multiple. Sometimes people like to put it right in the same electrical room as the sub panel. Well, if you start having 2 or 3 or 4 inverters, electrical rooms tend to be small. It might be that it's not all going to fit. If you start putting inverters on the wall and now you can't open the door of the sub panel all the way, things like that. So there's safety considerations that you want to know ahead of time during that walkthrough before you get the contractors there with the building electrical engineer or somebody comparable, so that you know, can it fit in that electrical room? Does it have to be in an adjacent room? Should it be on the roof? Other things you'd like to take a look at is the electrical conduit. It's going to be up on the roof. It's going to run along the roof somewhere, collect all the energy from all of the PV, and then go into the building at some place. Do they specify exactly where that needs to go? Do you have raceways in the ceiling tiles of all of your rooms, and it's got to tie into this raceway to get to that sub panel, or can they just put it anywhere on the wall, depending on the size of your facility, etc. There can be different ways, but you'd like to know ahead of time what to tell the contractors what they'll need to be doing. Likewise, when you're on the roof, there's other people who use the roof, people who maintain the HVAC system. There's a lot of equipment up there. They need to be able to get to that. If there's skylights, people need to be able to get to that. Drains on the roof. If you're going to be covering it up with PV, you got to make sure that that system is not going to impede the drain. And most of the time, you like to not cover drains at all. You want to make sure if there's some issue with it not draining properly, you can see it and find it directly, not have to move a couple panels away to go and verify that. So those are things you want to have discussions about and learn ahead of time, so that there's no question later. Everyone is bidding on the same things, knowing I have to run the conduit this way, or I have options. And I have to put the inverter on this wall in this room, or I have options. Having that clarified will help everybody. Often the contractors want to see the sub panel the system's going to tie into to make sure that there's room. When you look at a sub panel, typically we have all these circuits that go out from the sub panel to feed your building loads. PV is kind of weird. It looks like a circuit, but it's a circuit feeding into that same sub panel. The electricity it feeds in then goes out to the building loads. But there has to be room on the sub-panel to put that in. So the contractors want to see, is there room? Well, if you go and you're doing the site tour and then it's like, oh, it's a locked sub-panel, I can't get into it. It really inhibits your walkthrough. So check on keys and availability for all things like that. Getting access to the roof. Make sure that person has the keys or will give you the keys, to make sure that that happens. Again, I highly recommend if you have the building electrical person there on site with you, answering questions that you can't answer, that's a good thing. The person in charge of the roof answering those questions, and you get fewer questions later, and that's one of the goals. Okay. Permitting is something that, is always a consideration. And again, if there's lack of clarity, who's responsible for what, clarifying it ahead of time makes it easier for everybody. Establish what you're going to do and what the bidder should do. You can put it all on them. A lot of these are typical permits that are pretty straightforward. A building permit for things on top of the roof or for parking. Sometimes even for a ground mount system, if there's concrete in the ground, it becomes sort of a fixed system. So it might be an issue. If it's just on a vacant lot, maybe it's not an issue, a little bit dependent upon your city or county, what the rules might be. Electrical permits, everything, of course, should be built to NEC code. All of the developers will know that, and that's pretty common. But you might also have city code or county code that, they need to adhere to as well. Someone will have to inspect it, maybe the city inspector, maybe the utility inspector, and it should help verify that everything is to code. But there's the permits associated with that. Are those going to be things you expect them to pull? Typically, I would say yes, they do that all the time. Put those kinds of things on them if at all possible. Environmental can be a little bit more of a wild card. It depends. Often on building roofs, it's not such an issue, but if your building happens to be adjacent to a wetland or a wildlife refuge, then maybe it could be an issue. If it's near an airport, there could be some reflectivity issues, things like that. So you just want to understand what the issues may be and then decide who is going to resolve them. If a permit, environmental permits compared to the others can sometimes take a longer period of time to secure, and for the developers, time is money. It's okay if it's going to take 3 months, if that's a set fixed period of time. But if it could be 3 months to 9 months, that kind of ambiguity weighs heavily in their pricing because they can't afford to wait around, 9 months. They're going to have to charge you for that because they want to build things and move on to the next project. I've seen some states and some agencies sometimes having to go with the lowest bidder. There's different language around it. It can be lowest bidder of comparable, quality or comparable equipment, but sometimes they're inhibited by the lowest cost criteria. And if you do have that, I would suggest maybe working with your legal team to recharacterize it in some way. A popular term I've heard is best value. And at the end of the day, that's what you want for your system anyways, is the best value for the city. But you can help people define that best value in your criteria. Ryan had flashed this up earlier where he had the cost effectiveness being worth 40 points. Well, you could lower that to 20 points and make other things more important, such as local projects that are successful. You can call those business owners up and ask, hey, so-and-so put the system on the roof. One, what was the quality of their work? Does it work like they said they would? How are they to contract with? That could be an important way to verify what kind of contractor this is with the bid, their experience, job support and other things. You're the one who determines what that criteria is. And, again, if lowest cost is an issue, working with that criteria to make the lowest cost not be the highest point value is a way to focus on best value for the city. Sometimes you're going to get people coming in with different sized systems on their bid. You said maximize the roof area, and so they maximized it, but they came out with different sizes. That means, of course, they're going to be different costs. How do you evaluate which one is the best? So we just take a look at a couple ideas. One is to, try to break it down on a per unit basis. So here's some of the criteria that might have come in. They tell you how much energy, project A or bidder A, this project will make and someone else says this is how much it will make. It's obviously a larger system, 255 kilowatts versus 283 kilowatts. We expect it to make more energy. We expect project bidder B to be more expensive. It's a larger system. We expect them to have more savings in the first year. It's a larger system. But that's hard to compare. But if we go and take a look at it on a per unit basis, well, then maybe we can tell a little bit more. So we look at, well, how much energy are they producing per kilowatt? And we see, oh, they're identical. Well, that tells me a couple things. That means they're using the same solar resource file, like PV watts or whatever it is, maybe using the exact same software. If they come up with the same production per kilowatt, then I know that's a good thing, that well, at least that part's apples to apples. Now I can dive in on some of the other criteria. Installed cost per kilowatt. And now we can see it's not a huge difference, but bidder A does have a lower cost per kilowatt at $9.45 versus $9.75. So that's a good thing. That really speaks to real savings for you and for the city. They told us what the savings would be for 1 year, but then how about if we go and look at, well, what's the lifetime savings? And then divide it by kilowatts to determine which is the better deal. And when I do that, well, it looks like the lifetime savings is greater for bidder B. But if we have all the information that went into their calculation, I find they were actually using a 2% energy escalation rate, whereas bidder A was using 1.5%. So maybe that's really the cause of that difference, and it's not that it's making that much more energy or on a per kilowatt basis making that. So it's just, again, getting the information so you can analyze the bids is helpful. So we've covered a lot of different things here. There's many more, of course, but the point of it is thinking ahead of time to add clarity to the RFP, providing consistent information for the developer so they know what they're bidding on, and making it easier for them to bid on comparable projects so that you can evaluate apples to apples. And as some folks, I think Carrie was one mentioning, a spreadsheet. If they fill out the spreadsheet, you don't even have to pull it out of their proposals. That can take a lot of work when you're trying to pull it out of their PDF proposals, and then you find, hey, this developer doesn't have this number, but these other two do. And yeah, now what do I do? If you have the spreadsheet, it's clear. Don't leave them blank. Fill it in before you turn it in, and then it makes your job easier.
All right, well, thanks, Roby, for walking us through some of those sticking points that come up when developing an RFP. That wraps up the webinar for today. If you have additional questions, feel free to look at our website at cityrenewables.org/onsite solar to follow the process and find additional resources there. Thanks.